Yo, it's your boy Logos, and throughout many of my uploads, I reference my love for history, especially military history. Well, today I want to talk about my favorite battle of all time, the Battle of Cannae. And it's kind of funny it's my favorite battle of all time, considering I'm a Roman Empire stan, and I always study their history, even though I know so much about it. The tactical maneuvering, and also trying to understand the politics and intrigue being involved with history, is one of the many reasons why I love it so much. Game of Thrones, Vikings, and in my opinion, soap operas, reality television, always try to grasp at the same straws that history does for me. Entertainment, intrigue, trying to decipher lies and propaganda, following the story, following a hero or a villain. All this stuff occurs in history. You have the Macedonians, you have the Romans, you have the Mongols, you have the Chinese, you have so many different civilizations, so much knowledge. You could it's honestly impossible to know it all, but that's what I love about it. Being able to learn more, understand it more, and try to be like a little Sherlock Holmes, include together pieces of evidence together, having context. It just made studying history so much fun. So I want to talk about this one battle in particular, the Battle of Cannae, and how important it is and how impressive it is. So let's get into it.
He was born to fight, raised to accept nothing less than victory on the battlefield. He is the great military commander from Carthage, Hannibal. Hannibal's lifelong mission: destroy Rome or die trying. Hannibal battles his way across the frozen Alps, bloodies the ground with tens of thousands of Rome's fiercest warriors, and makes military history on a battlefield where he slaughters 70,000 men in one day. Hannibal is a killer. Hannibal is a conqueror. Hannibal is the annihilator. The year 219 BC, the man, Hannibal Barca of Carthage, one of history's greatest and deadliest generals. Hannibal burns the Roman town of Saguntum to the ground. These smoldering flames are just the initial sparks of the raging inferno that will soon engulf Europe as Hannibal the Annihilator launches a bloody reign of vengeance aimed to crush mighty Rome. Hannibal's home of Carthage is a commercial beacon on the northern coast of Africa. Their trade and military influence reverberates throughout the Mediterranean.
They traded far and wide, as far off to the eastern Mediterranean. There's even some evidence that they traded as far west through the Straits of Gibraltar to England.
400 short miles from Carthage is Rome, though not.
I just want to give a little bit of background on Carthage, and also, it just makes me laugh every time I see it, but Hannibal Barca is not black or, have African or dark skin. Carthage is from the Phoenician colonies, and Phoenicians are Greeks, so the chances of him having dark skin is slim to none. But Carthage is a Phoenician former trade colony, and they was able to grow and establish to be their own empire, and they have an empire, Carthage, going from Spain over here on the left side, going to the west towards Egypt. They don't conquer Egypt or they don't own Egypt, but they have land and vassals over here to the east of where it shows Carthage, like Libya and other places like that. The Libyan cavalry, and I'm not sure about the infantry, but the cavalry from Libya is famously for being very high discipline and tactical, very, very good. Not to the, level of like a Roman legionnaire or anything like that, but what they do, which is cavalry and that type of combat, is very hard to get better than the Libyan cavalry.
Not yet the colossal empire they will become. Their military might threatens Carthaginian commercial dominance in the region.
The Romans are very much a warlike imperial people. They're not an empire yet, but you could definitely see this republic starting to expand its borders. It was only a matter of time before Rome and Carthage bumped into one another.
Hannibal's personal and brutal destruction of Saguntum is a bloody invitation, hand-delivered to Rome, inviting them to join his deadly game of butchery and annihilation.
The siege of Saguntum lasted 8 months, as far as we know. We're pretty much lacking in detail from a historical perspective. What we do know, however, is that once the walls were breached and Carthaginian troops went in, they went house to house and hunted down almost all of the Roman families, killed the Roman males, and sold the women and children into slavery.
Through the smoke and stench of scorched earth and torched Roman corpses comes Rome's response: capture Hannibal and crucify him.
It's a very famous scene by the Greek historian Polybius, where the Roman ambassador grabs his toga, a fold in each hand, and says, "Rome offers you peace or war. Choose, it matters not to Rome."
Okay, so I was trying to wait a little bit before like jumping in and giving some context about this war, because I assumed they was gonna like talk about the prelude to it. Hannibal Barca's father, Hamilcar, fought the Romans before. He was like a mercenary general hired by the Carthaginians, and they fought in Sicily. Sicily is what Sicily is today. Those two small islands, and that led to no, I'm sorry, just one small island. I'm thinking of Corsica, but Sicily, that started this whole war between the Carthaginians and the Romans. From my memory, it led to like mercenaries not getting paid, and they revolted and took over a town. And then that same town asked both the Carthaginians and the Romans for help, and that led to a clash between the two of them. And what they said at the beginning, that one guy said, it does make sense about kind of being inevitable, because they both had influence over Syracuse. Like literally, Sicily is right by Italy, and then you have Carthage have I think settlements on the western coast or the western half of Sicily. So it kind of was inevitable because Rome was expanding. They got through conquering the Etruscans and all the other hill tribes and mountain tribes in Italy. So they were the dominant force. It wasn't necessarily controlling it how you would imagine it. They had like allies. So it would be like, I don't want to say like city states, because I think that's oversimplifying it, try to relate it to the Greeks. But they didn't necessarily fully control it the same way they control Rome. They had allies that they had superiority over, but it wasn't actually Roman citizens yet. And that's actually very important, because that plays on later in the future when Rome has a civil war called the Social War. And social, or socii, that was the actual, I think, Latin word for it, the socii war. Socii just means ally. So it was a war of the allies. The Italian cities within Italy that wasn't actually Roman citizens, they revolted after a senator got murdered trying to help them get citizenship. That person got murdered because the senators of Rome saw him as trying to get ultimate power. It's a whole long and deep story that actually ties into the fall of the Republic, actually. If you're interested in knowing about that, definitely check out Dan Carlin's Death Throes of the Republic, and he talks about the whole lead up to Julius Caesar, the Gracchi brothers, Gaius Marius, Sulla, Caesar, like such and so forth. It's very, very interesting. It's like 10 hours, but definitely check it out.
Hannibal and the Carthaginians gladly choose to fight.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got completely sidetracked. So this is the second Punic War. This whole the battle of Cannae and the battles leading up to it. This is the second Punic War. What I was saying earlier about his father, Hamilcar Barca, that was the first Punic War. It kind of ended in a stalemate, and they had peace. So that kind of explains why Rome, plus they're militaristic, but it kind of explains why Rome already had this just not giving a damn about peace at all. But that was a Roman thing. They were like kind of famous for being very crass with their diplomats. They wasn't very subtle. They would definitely like do things to piss you off or disrespect you, because they knew there was nothing you could do. They had the legions. So you could get mad at the diplomat for being so crass or threatening if you want. But what he said is true. If you don't do what we say, we're gonna send legions over, and it's gonna be done anyway. And yeah, that'll piss you off, but what can you do to fight them? You don't have an army as organized or better led than the Romans to beat them. So it just is what it is. And actually leading up to this whole war and the sacking of Saguntum, Hannibal was actually, being sussed out by the Romans, because they saw him like conquering places in Spain. He was getting money. He was building up towns. He was building up settlements. He was getting his army together. And they had scouts and spies related to Rome. They sent senators and they talked to him, asked him what he's doing. And he was like, I'm just getting all this money together to pay you back. Unless I'm getting that confused with his father. But either way, this whole relationship between Carthage and Rome is nothing new. This has been going on over and over again. And there's going to be another Punic War to finally settle this.
It is war, the seeds of which were planted nearly half a century earlier. Then, Carthage and Rome bloodied the Mediterranean Sea in what is called the First Punic War, named for the Latin term for Carthage,
I wasn't sure you were
Punica.
gonna mention it.
400,000 casualties. Almost 15% of the military manpower of the entire country of Italy was lost in that war. It was a terribly bloody war.
The war eventually ends in a military draw, but for Carthage, the peace treaty is especially costly.
Part of the deal they make with Rome is that Carthage will limit their navy to 100 ships. This is pretty crippling to an empire that was a naval and commercial trading power.
With most of their commercial fleet gone and their pockets empty, Carthage uses its military power to exploit the riches of Spain.
Turns out that Spain's got vast silver mines, and the Carthaginians quickly gain a hold on them and amass a fortune. They decide to build up their land defenses instead of their navy, which had been pretty much depleted in the First Punic War.
Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, one of Carthage's most accomplished and battle-hardened men, leads the army into Spain.
Now, Hamilcar Barca is the founder of a great military dynasty in Carthage called the Barcids, after the name Barca, and he really hated the Romans.
Young Hannibal is immersed in a violent and bloody world as he watches his father, teacher, and role model engage in fiercely brutal combat.
Hannibal is only 9 when Hamilcar takes over Spain, so he essentially grows up on the battlefield.
Hamilcar provides young Hannibal with a hands-on education in brutality and warfare.
So by the time he's 19, his whole life has been in a military camp. And here he watches his father and other general officers and learns how to command men.
Hannibal learns that to build an army of loyal fighters willing to march by his side into the horrors of war, he must sometimes punish his own. If a Carthaginian officer fails in battle, he is crucified in the public square.
Carthaginian rule in Spain is downright cruel. It's based on fire, sword, and crucifixion.
But Hannibal also motivates his men by sleeping where they sleep, eating what they eat, and fighting where they fight. They obediently follow his words, his sword, and his deep-seated desire for revenge against Rome, which he inherits from his father. But
The whole idea of crucifixion isn't like just a Carthaginian thing or a Roman thing. That was an ancient world type of thing. Rome, for example, Pompey the Great, no, I'm sorry, not Pompey, Crassus. I think he crucified, 10,000 slaves after the slave revolt that had Spartacus involved. So crucifixion was nothing new, especially by the time of Jesus and such and so forth.
Hamilcar will never taste revenge. In 228 BC, he dies suddenly. Some say assassinated.
His place is taken by his son-in-law, called Hasdrubal the Splendid, who continues on again for about another 6 years, building Carthaginian power, increasing its scope, and then finally he's assassinated too. And there's some question historically of whether or not Hannibal had a hand in this.
It is finally Hannibal's hour. He is only 26 years old, but commands the entire Carthaginian army. But he is fierce, battle-tested, and driven.
Legend has it that Hamilcar made the young Hannibal swear an oath on the altar of Baal that he would spend his life in opposing and then ultimately destroying Rome.
In 219 BC, with his father's hunger for revenge burning inside him, and with Saguntum aflame, Hannibal launches his attack against Rome. The Second Punic War is on.
Hannibal amasses a strike force of about 50,000 soldiers. But because he has no navy, he's got to invade Italy by land.
Hannibal's on the move. From Spain, he leads his fighting force of about 50,000 north along the Mediterranean coast toward Rome. A grueling 2.5 months later, An exhausted but battle-ready Hannibal reaches the Rhone River. But Hannibal is shocked to discover the Romans had caught wind of the advance and launched a strike force to intercept.
The Romans had caught wind of Hannibal's movements in Spain. But instead of heading directly to Spain, they were smart. They looked at a map, figured out where Hannibal was going to march, and tried to block the land route to the Italian peninsula on the coast of the Mediterranean.
It is the great military Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio who leads the attack against Hannibal. Scipio's force, 10,000 men strong, is in Massilia, a Roman ally on the Mediterranean coast. Hannibal's force, 5 times as large, has crossed the Rhone River.
Massilia is a Greek colony, so it is a Greek city, similar to Syracuse, which is another Greek colony on the island of Sicily, like on the east coast. So the Greeks was all around the Mediterranean for a very long time. You had the Carthaginians, you had the Massilia, you had the Syracusans. There was many Greeks all around the Mediterranean world. Excuse me.
Scipio sends 300 of his cavalry up the Rhone to find Hannibal. Hannibal orders 500 cavalry to scout the Roman advance. The 2 reconnaissance units collide. War between Rome and Carthage rages once again.
This is a small skirmish between scouting parties. In this particular skirmish, Hannibal's forces take the brunt of the attack and then retreat. Scipio orders his entire force to follow.
Hannibal knows Scipio is only a few days' march away, and Scipio is a talented commander. He should be able to give Hannibal a run for his money.
But when Scipio arrives at the location where Hannibal's army should be, they're gone. It's as if Hannibal's whole army has vanished into thin air.
Scipio forced Hannibal to change his plan. Now, instead of marching along the Mediterranean coast to Rome, Hannibal's attack will come from the north, through the Alps.
The reason why Hannibal came by land through Spain and over the Alps was not because it was a great strategic choice. It was, in fact, the route that was forced upon him by, essentially, Roman events, by the situation he confronted at the time.
Hannibal reaches the Alps in autumn of 218 BC. At this altitude, he and his 50,000 soldiers face freezing temperatures and treacherous ice on a narrow, rocky terrain. The men are hungry, their supplies are limited, and he's leading more than just infantry. He's also leading 9,000 cavalry and 37 elephants.
All the major armies had a few elephants in them. When the Greeks fought Carthage in one of their little skirmishes, the Carthaginians used to have chariots, and they were driven from the battlefield by the elephants, at which point they said, let's get rid of the chariots and replace them with elephants. And so as a consequence, by the time of the Punic War, Carthage has, in her home, just in her home base, she has 300 trained elephants living in the walls of the city of Carthage. So that's how you get the elephant introduced in warfare.
The crossing of the Alps with such a large force is a difficult military feat. For Hannibal and his army, it has horrific consequences.
Men freeze, men starve. At one point, a landslide completely blocks their way. It's absolutely hellish. Supplies are even running low, and they're not even to the most difficult part of the crossing yet.
Well, they happen upon this Gallic village where the Gauls offer provisions and supplies. Hannibal accepts the help, but he definitely is suspicious of their motives because he knows that sometimes the Gauls are friendly and sometimes they are not.
Hannibal doesn't fully trust the Gauls, but eventually accepts their help. The Gauls direct Hannibal to a narrow pass which leads to a gorge.
Hannibal's original suspicions were right on. The guides suddenly bolt.
It's a trap. In 218 BC, Hannibal leads his Carthaginian army over the treacherous Alps to invade Rome. Along the way, marauding Gauls ambush Hannibal with a barrage of boulders and arrow fire.
Hannibal encounters different tribes throughout his campaign. They were mainly Gauls. This is a tribal people who lived in what's now modern-day France. They're not a unified people and usually don't ally themselves against a common enemy. So sometimes they'll join his war on Rome, and other times they'll attack him.
In this case, the Gauls are out for blood. The gorge turns into a gauntlet of death.
Gauls block both ends of the gorge, but Hannibal's troops fight their way out, leaving the butchered enemy in their wake. After some 30 grueling days, Hannibal and his men emerge from the Alps. When they finally arrive on the northern plains of Italy, nearly a third of Hannibal's army has perished.
They lose about 18,000 infantry, about a third of the cavalry, which would be maybe 4,000 horse, you know, you arrive with, say, 27 elephants, you lose a third of the elephants.
But Hannibal has always known the crossing would be costly. From the very beginning of the war, he's had a plan to replenish his forces, a plan that relied on his elephants.
Part of Hannibal's strategy in crossing the Alps was that he understood that he didn't have enough manpower to fight the Romans. Therefore, he would have to acquire it once he got into Italy. How was he going to do that? He was going to do that by attracting to his standard the Gauls, the Celts and Gauls, who hated the Romans because they've been fighting one another for 500 years, and hopefully as well get some Roman allied states to defect. So the reason for bringing the 37 elephants over the Alps was really to impress, in a political sense, both the Gauls and the allied states that this was a serious army.
Hannibal's elephants thunder into northern Italy. They successfully lure Gallic tribes to the Carthaginian side. By November 218 BC, Hannibal's numbers swell to nearly 40,000. Rome answers with 40,000 of its own soldiers to face Hannibal's threat. Both armies are now on a collision course that will rock the ancient world and rewrite military history.
The armies of Carthage and Rome couldn't be more different. Hannibal's men are mercenary soldiers from all over the map.
Hannibal's army is from different parts of the region, many of them mercenaries, drawn to his legendary leadership in battle. The light infantry are from Libya. These men carry a small round shield and fight with a small sword or javelin. Heavy infantry are warriors from Gaul, men who run into battle naked, intimidating their enemies with their deadly two-handed broadswords. Heavy cavalry is from Spain and Northern Europe. Their weapon of choice is either a bowed sword called a falcata or a deadly longsword.
Hannibal's ability to orchestrate these different types of forces in a coordinated attack is what makes him truly a remarkable general. The Roman army is much different than Hannibal's forces. Where the Carthaginians are very diverse, the Romans are quite uniform.
Roman soldiers are ablaze in armor. Bronze helmets protect their heads. Chainmail or brass breastplates defend their bodies. Each soldier carries one of history's deadliest throwing spears, the pilum.
That long metal rod was made of soft metal with a hook. When it went through the shield, the weight of the wooden body would bend it. You couldn't take the pilum out of the shield. Now the enemy had a choice of fighting with a shield with a spear stuck into it, or what they foolishly did very often is simply throw the shield away. Not a good move against Roman infantry.
Slaughter also comes in the form of a straight sword, forged of iron, ideal for up-close and personal combat. Their scutum shield provides almost complete protection from missile attacks. While Hannibal's army is cobbled together, his opponent is a much more cohesive fighting force.
The Roman army was a true national army. They all spoke the same language, they all had the same equipment, and they were all trained to the same tactics.
But the most significant difference is their style of battle.
So you have this Roman force of highly disciplined citizen soldiers equipped and trained to go straight at the enemy against a group of professionals that can hit you in any number of ways.
At the Ticinus River, these radically different fighting styles clash in a hurricane of violence.
Hannibal's light cavalry surround the Romans, slash at the Roman cavalry, then back off, then re-attack. It's chaos and confusion, not what the Romans are used to.
The blood of 2,000 slain Roman soldiers drenches the ground. It is a shocking defeat.
The key point about the little skirmish at the Ticinus River was that Publius Scipio was wounded.
The Romans replaced Scipio with General Sempronius Longus, a strong leader with an even stronger temper.
Sempronius is a hothead. He's desperate for glory, and his one-year term as army commander is almost up. He's champing at the bit to fight, and Hannibal knows it.
Some evidence of Hannibal's brilliance as a military commander was the fact that he studied his adversaries closely. Now, where he got this information isn't clear. Surely the number of Roman commanders was relatively small, and so they would have been well known. But also my guess is that the truly excellent Carthaginian intelligence may have been at work here, so that whenever he was prepared for a battle, he knew who was in command on the other side, and he studied him closely, knew for his strengths and weaknesses. And in the case of Sempronius, he knew Sempronius well. He knew he was a hothead, and he played him like a fiddle.
Because the whole situation was, there was two generals at the time. From my memory, I want to say the two consular, the consuls. Consuls for Rome is basically like their version of like the president, but they had two of them, and they both had power, but the whole point of them was to check each other. That way they had two of them. And these consuls, for the most part, they would go out and lead consular armies. So what the thing is, when you have two generals at the same place of battle, they will alternate days of command. So one day, Sempronius, he'll be in charge, but then the other day, his colleague, I can't remember his exact name right now, but he will be in charge. So what they said is true. Hannibal, he will wait to get Sempronius because he knows much more of a hothead. He could draw him into a battle when it's favorable for Hannibal, and at that point, he can come up with a strategy to destroy this army. And he does this over and over and over again.
The two enemy armies camp on opposite sides of the Trebia River, about 70 short yards apart.
It's not much of an obstacle in a physical sense, but it can become an obstacle when you realize that if you have to cross it, it's November, it's gray, and it's snowing. And so that's going to be, any army that tries to cross that river under those conditions is going to suffer somewhat.
Hannibal's strategy? Take advantage of the frigid temperatures, the Roman commander's fiery temper, and use the element of surprise.
He sends 2,000 or 3,000 cavalry in the early morning dawn across the river to attack the Roman camp.
The Romans are shocked awake. They stumble around the cold with no food. The Roman general Sempronius is furious. He orders the men to cross the river and attack, so they plunge into the icy water to chase Hannibal's men. Not the best way to start your day.
40,000 Roman infantry and 4,000 cavalry cross the river. They line up for battle in a formation called a legio, made up of several maniples.
Maniple literally means a handful of men. Each maniple consists of about 120 soldiers.
The Romans arrange themselves in a checkerboard configuration. This is a force specifically designed to move forward and crush its enemy. But Hannibal has his own crushing machines. Pachyderms, the heavy tanks of the Carthaginian army.
I just want to go back and
move
talk about the
forward and
Roman
crush its
infantry.
enemy. But Hannibal has his own crushing.
So the Roman infantry wasn't always like this. It used to be very similar to the Greek hoplite formations, you know, known for Sparta, the 300 Spartans, that type of fighting. They eventually had to maneuver and change up their tactics and strategy when it came to fighting due to them fighting in Italy. I think I mentioned it earlier about the mountain tribes and the hill tribes within Italy, but fighting on the mountains or on hills really prevented the hoplite phalanx from working the way it's supposed to, because you need to have solid flat ground so everybody can be in formation, so everybody's shields is overlapping each other. But if you have hilly, rocky formations, you can't have a straight line. You can't have cohesiveness. And when you have cohesiveness or flanks open, that just leaves you get decimated, especially when you find in the hills or mountains, a place you're not used to. These mountain tribes like the Samnites or the Etruscans, they would be very, very difficult for Rome to fight. And it took them a very long time to conquer Italy, have control over it. That's part of the reason why I would say that Carthage had control of Sicily and maybe Sardinia and Corsica, simply because of the fact that Italy and Rome was fighting within itself for a very long time. They had ups and downs. They wasn't always going through good things. And I think they mentioned it earlier, like Celtic and the Gauls were fighting with Rome for like 500 years. The whole sacking of Rome, the first sacking of Rome, was by the Gauls. And that whole fear and I don't know what superstition of the Gauls coming back is played into in the Roman politics over and over and over again. Gaius Marius, I think Julius Caesar, all these different people play on that old memory of Rome being sacked and just being in the hands of I think a Gaulish tribal leader. And I think that's where you get the famous quote, "Woe to the vanquished," because when they came up with this deal to have peace or to get the Gauls out of Rome during the first sacking of Rome, they tampered with the scales. So the scales wasn't fair, and the Rome had to pay more gold than they actually thought was fair. And when they said this and mentioned this to the Gaulish leader or the Gaulish diplomat, he threw his sword on top of the scales to make it even heavier in his favor and said, "Woe to the vanquished." He was basically saying, "Screw you, you lost, pay up or I kill you." So this whole Rome went through a lot to get where they are now, where they can fight in a strong, cohesive, confident way against Hannibal, even if they have lost before previously against him. Plus, like I said previously, this is the second Punic War, not the first one. So it's not like this whole type of warfare or the brutality of it is anything new to them.
Crushing machines, pachyderms, the heavy tanks of the Carthaginian army. They charge at the flanks of the Roman cavalry.
Nearly impervious to spears, the elephant's earth-shaking assault scatters the allied horsemen in sheer terror.
Hannibal's cavalry, 10,000 strong, far outnumbers the Romans.
His Numidian cavalry is so fast and agile that they appear to be everywhere at once.
Hannibal's heavy Spanish and Celtic cavalry slam with such force they demolish what's left of the Roman cavalry.
Hannibal's Carthaginian cavalry turns inward and smashes the Roman flanks. Hannibal surrounds the Romans on 3 sides, but he is not done yet. Hannibal has just crossed the Trebia River and has a bloody surprise for the Roman army. Using specially trained horses, Hannibal has successfully hidden cavalry in the tall grass.
Trumpet blasts and an elite Carthaginian cavalry force charges from the swamp. The Romans turn around to see 2,000 horses storm up from behind. It must have been absolutely terrifying.
The Carthaginian cavalry blindsides the Romans, who are then pushed back toward the river and cut down mercilessly.
Of the 40,000 men, Roman and allies, that took the field that day, 30,000 died. 30,000 met their deaths on the bank of the Trebia River. It was the worst defeat that the Romans had suffered since the defeat against the Gauls 125 years earlier.
The Battle of the Trebia is an absolutely classic example of how to use tactical surprise at a key moment in the battle. The result was complete slaughter.
Hannibal does suffer losses at Trebia. All but one of his elephants die of starvation or exhaustion. He rides the lone survivor named Sirius. The horror of Trebia spurs the Roman Senate to raise 4 new legions, 20,000 men. Rome also appoints 2 new consuls to lead the men into battle, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Their target, Hannibal. Their mission, seek and destroy. In the spring of 217 BC, the Romans decide that the best way to block Hannibal's advance southward is to divide their forces. Geminus travels northeast to coastal Ariminus. Flaminius heads northwest to Arretium, but they leave a southern route open through the marshes of the lower Arno River Valley.
Now, the Arno marshes were an enormously large, swampy area created by the Arno River. I mean, it's full of muck. insects, snakes. It is a terrible natural barrier, so much so that neither of the Roman commanders blocking the roads on either side thought anyone would be crazy enough to try to march through these marshes. Well, Hannibal is known for doing the unexpected, and don't you know, he tries to penetrate these marshes.
The surprise maneuver does prove costly for Hannibal.
While riding atop Sirius, his last remaining elephant, Hannibal is supposedly stung in the eye by an insect. He gets infected, and he becomes blind in that eye.
But Hannibal remains unstoppable. He slips through the two Roman forces and arrives at Tuscany, a Roman ally, and torches the landscape.
Hannibal starts burning the Tuscan plain. Houses, towns, slaughtering animals, chopping down trees.
Hannibal's plan: destroy the area and infuriate the Roman general Flaminius, who watches the devastation from the city walls of Arretium.
And Flaminius is just horrified by it. He's horrified not only so much that this area is being destroyed, but he knows what Hannibal is doing.
Instead of attacking Flaminius inside the city walls, Hannibal is sending a message to other Roman allies.
And what Hannibal is saying to that ally is, if you stay with Rome, this is what you can expect. He's trying to woo that ally away. And Flaminius also knows that it's a sign of Roman weakness that you cannot stop this.
Hannibal knows his enemy well and wants to lure Flaminius onto the battlefield.
Why? That's his plan. Destroy as many Roman armies, kill as many Romans as you can until the Roman Senate tires of war and sues for peace. You can't do that with siege warfare. You've got to draw the enemy out into battle.
Hannibal continues to taunt Flaminius by marching his army right past the walls of Arretium, flaunting his courage and power.
Hannibal is just far enough away to tease Flaminius. He's really saying, come on, if you've got any courage, you'll leave your little protective fort and come and fight like a man.
Finally, Flaminius takes the bait.
Hannibal leads Flaminius on a wild chase across Tuscany. He stays a day or two ahead, which allows him to survey the terrain and pick the most advantageous place to fight.
Moving quickly, Hannibal and his 30,000 men race past the small village of Pasignano into a hilly forest along Lake Trasimene. Flaminius is in hot pursuit. The road leads Hannibal, now on horseback, through what's known as a defile, a narrow passage between the mountains and the lake's shoreline.
By now, all of Hannibal's elephants are dead. And as he marches into this defile, this narrow passage between the cliffs and the lake, he becomes immediately aware of the landscape's tactical advantages.
Hannibal has discovered the perfect location for his next battle. It comes with its own natural advantage.
In the morning, a thick fog comes off the lake and obscures the entire valley. It's made-to-order camouflage.
Hannibal orders some of his men to camp at the far end of the valley, in plain view of all who pass through the defile.
We're told that Hannibal sends scouts far ahead into the hills to light campfires. He wants to convince the Romans that he's farther away than he actually is.
Still chasing Hannibal, Flaminius reaches Pasignano and sends a reconnaissance team into the defile.
They come back and it's too narrow. There can't be any possibility of ambush. The next day, around dawn, the Roman army begins to move through the defile.
It happens over and over and over again. The Roman scouting is terrible no matter what era or century. Yes, they do send scouts, but of course they don't go far enough, or they not as, well trained as they should be to be able to locate Hannibal and see his army. This happens almost 400 or 300 and so years later under Augustus. I can't remember the exact name of the general, but when he traveled through I think into Germany, the famous battle where he was flanked on both sides by a traitorous Gaulish or a traitorous Germanic person who was actually like a Roman I won't say Roman citizen, but he was raised in Rome. He seemed to be adopting Roman culture, but then he betrayed the Romans and led them into this trap. It just happens so often. that the Romans just get destroyed because they don't scout places as effectively. At least you have, you some generals like Julius Caesar and Pompey, Scipio Africanus, which shows up later on in this war. Those generals are one of the best generals of all time, in my opinion, for their scouting, for their tactical understanding of terrain, similar to Hannibal. I mean, if you know about Roman history, you know about Julius Caesar doing the double walls at Alesia, or what he did against Pompey the Great in their civil war at I think Dyrrhachium, or somewhere around Illyria at that point in time in the empire. It just certain generals know what to do, and other generals just go with their hot head and chase glory.
As Flaminius reaches the valley, the eerie lake fog rolls in once again. In the distance, Flaminius can see the fires of Hannibal's camp on the hill.
Flaminius thinks, I finally got him. I've got Hannibal trapped, and it's time to tear him apart.
Flaminius orders 6,000 Roman soldiers to rush up the hill and attack Hannibal.
The legion double times, gets out there, climbs the hill, and smashes into Hannibal's camp.
The Romans hack at Hannibal's rearguard infantry in wild combat. Suddenly, Hannibal's men turn and run, enticing the Roman soldiers to pursue. Hannibal then springs one of the deadliest traps in military history. Hannibal Barca of Carthage is about to spring one of military history's greatest traps. 30,000 Carthaginian infantry and cavalry rise out of the morning fog and smash into the stunned Roman force. The bloodbath begins. The battle rages along the shores of Lake Trasimene in northwest Italy. Hannibal's Spanish and African heavy infantry hit the Roman front. Wild Celtic tribesmen strike the center. Numidian light cavalry crush the Romans from the rear.
Earlier when I was talking about the African cavalry, I got it confused with the Libyans. It is actually Numidian cavalry I was talking about. The Libyan infantry is what Libya was pretty famous for. I think they also did have good horsemen, but Numidian cavalry was like famous throughout the ancient world for having very, very good cavalry.
Romans are trapped, and in this terrible, they're in line of march, they're not even set for combat formation, their weapons on out, and they're taken right in the flank by this large army, and it just slaughters them. It slaughters them.
Hannibal makes two big gambles at Trasimene. First is that the fog will return to hide his 30,000 men in the hills. Second, that Flaminius will jump at his decoy camp. And he wins both bets.
Out of 20,000 men, 15,000 die in about 3 hours, including Flaminius himself. Hannibal's losses, 1,500. That's a kill ratio of 10-to-1.
In one of the most successful ambushes in history, another Roman army has been wiped out. At age 27, Hannibal is already a legendary military tactician.
In less than 2 years, Hannibal has handed Rome 3 catastrophic defeats. 2,000 men at Ticinus, 30,000 at Trebia, and now 15,000 more at Trasimene. Rome had never seen such a series of defeats in its history.
In the face of this defeat, the Roman Senate makes a bold, perhaps desperate decision. They vote to appoint a temporary dictator over the military to put an end to Hannibal's reign of terror. He is Quintus Fabius Maximus.
Selecting a dictator is extremely rare in Roman history. They highly value their republic, and so the idea of handing absolute power to one man isn't taken lightly. In fact, the position came with an automatic time limit of 6 months.
Fabius raises an army of 90,000 men, the largest yet in Roman history. But he isn't going to use them in direct combat against Hannibal.
Okay, I want to stop right here because what Fabius Maximus does is something that I love, even though he gets a lot of shit for it. Not from, historians, people who love history, but actually the Romans itself, his contemporaries. But I'm going to save that for part 2 because it's already like 45 minutes long. This whole dictator thing for Rome is very true what they said. It would be in times of emergency, like when the public was about to fall or they about to be invaded. For example, for my memory, when the Gauls was coming to sack Rome the first time, I think they did appoint a dictator to help prevent that from happening. One famous dictator, it's not really famous among like wider known people today, even people that don't know history, but there's a city named after him. Cincinnatus, he was a dictator for the Romans, from my memory, and he gave up power. That's another cool thing about the dictatorship within Rome. People willingly gave up power. Sulla willingly gave up power, even though he took it through military force. It was a whole thing about freedom and just quote unquote want to restore the republic the way they saw it and the way it was. So oftentimes it was only used for emergency situations and times like this. You have Hannibal Barca destroying 3 or 4 of your armies, killing what 3 or 4 consuls so far. Yeah, you're gonna have to come up with a bigger army and give this guy absolute power to make sure that everybody is focused and concise on the same objective. You can't have politics, glory, or anything like that messing it up. So you have a dictator. But that's it for now. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's your boy Logos. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.